أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Afghanistan was the last hot war the USSR would fight, and one whose failure played a leading role in its loss of the Cold War and disintegration of the superpower.
Afghanistan was going through a fair amount of turmoil, with Mohammed Daoud being ousted and killed with his family in the April Revolution of 1978, and then having the Parcham and Khalq factions take over, essentially a sort of a nationalist communist alliance.
The Soviet Union decided to intervene militarily in Afghanistan in order to preserve the communist regime there. Based on information from the KGB, Soviet leaders felt that President Hafizullah Amin destabilized the situation in Afghanistan. Following Amin's initial coup against and the killing of President Taraki, the KGB station in Kabul warned Moscow that his leadership would lead to harsh repressions and, as a result, the activation and consolidation of the opposition.
The Soviets were simply, again, worried about the instability in Afghanistan, about losing so much that they'd already put in there, and about Americans or Chinese or Iranians or Pakistanis gaining a foothold or gaining greater influence. But at that point, they didn't see it as just a one-on incident.
The Soviet invasion was a long-planned operation whose groundwork was prepared well in advance. What was surprising was not the intervention itself, but the speed of the military buildup within Afghanistan and the ruthless elimination of the Amin regime. This was a period of giving the communist government in Moscow the benefit of the doubt regarding foreign relationships.
If you remember back to it, this was a period, of course, this is a time of sort of the late détente period. Things had gone downhill since Nixon and Brezhnev had signed accords in 1972. A number of conservatives in the U.S. were unhappy with détente and thought that we were giving too much away to the Soviets. We had been burned in Vietnam.
With Jimmy Carter in the White House, America was once again in a period of isolationism.
Carter came in as a president more determined to work with domestic issues. We had economic problems. You had the Iranian Revolution in 78 and 79, great loss of American influence in that state neighboring on Afghanistan. And the Soviets at this period look like they are an ascendant power while the U.S. is retrenching.
So it was a very different world than today, with two superpowers squaring off with their full military might, standing toe-to-toe in Europe. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a major surprise to the Carter administration, whose attention was focused on the West and the Persian Gulf.
It was unique in the sense that the Soviets had not moved into a country that was outside of the, say, the Warsaw Pact at that time.
The Carter administration was still pursuing in '79 its attempts to cooperate with the Soviet Union. There was a SALT II accord signed, I believe, in the summer of 1979. There was the famous worldwide picture of Carter and Brezhnev exchanging a smooch, right? So when 6 months later, basically, the Soviets went into Afghanistan, it was in many ways seen as a big affront to the U.S., although it was becoming clear in the debate in the United States that the Senate was not going to ratify the SALT II Accord during, the Carter administration first term, right? If it was reelected, maybe the circumstances would change, but there were all kinds of domestic circumstances working against that.
Until the coup in Afghanistan, Western observers had assumed that the massive Soviet airlift operation was aimed at bolstering the faltering Amin regime against the tribesmen who had successfully been waging a guerrilla war since mid-1978. On December 27, 1979, under cover of the ongoing Soviet military buildup, heavily armed elements of a Soviet airborne brigade were airlifted into Kabul, Afghanistan, to violently overthrow the regime of Amin.
And it's interesting that, first of all, the Soviets were reluctant to go in earlier in 1979. What had happened was after the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan took over in April of '78, they started enacting what were reforms not all that differently than what the Shah had done in Iran. Modernization reforms, especially getting women to lift the veil, educating girls. I'm not saying they were doing all good things, but they were modernizing, sort of communist modernizing reforms, and that generated a backlash in the countryside.
From a Soviet point of view, it appeared that the Soviets were about to lose all that they had invested in Afghanistan.
And they had really a lot invested in the country. It looked like they had a chance of losing that. And I believe they thought that as a country destabilized, that would open the door to American influence, to Pakistani influence, and we were quite close with Pakistan at that time, and also the possibility of Iranian influence.
The United States and a modernization program that did not fit the USSR plan for the country was not the only Soviet concern in Afghanistan.
But you had the possibility of Islamic fundamentalism. And recall that the Central Asian states, the 5 states on the south, are all Muslim. There had been some disturbances there below the surface, and so there was a worry about Islamic fundamentalism spreading into Soviet Central Asia. So they tried over the course of 1979 to get the communist leadership in Afghanistan to pull back on the reforms, to try to stabilize the situation there. And during that same period, from about March, April of '79 up till December, while they were trying to get the Afghans to pacify it, they also built up their military supplies, fuel and so on, positioned, forward positioned their troops and so on, and eventually I think just felt that the situation had gotten out of control.
Within hours after the beginning of this Trojan horse-type operation, Soviet troops had overwhelmed the elite Presidential Guard, captured Amin, and executed him, along with several members of his family, for crimes against the people. By nightfall, Soviet troops had gained undisputed control of key government buildings, military installations, and communications facilities in the capital. The second phase of the invasion began on December 28th, as 2 Soviet motorized infantry divisions crossed the frontier in 3 places in support of troops which had already been airlifted into Afghanistan. By week's end, Soviet armor columns were fanning out across Afghanistan to occupy major population centers, air bases, and strategic lines of communication. The Soviets were waging a full-fledged counterinsurgency campaign against rebellious Muslim tribesmen. By January 1st, 1980, the Soviets had injected at least 50,000 men and 200 aircraft into Afghanistan, along with a wide variety of armored vehicles, heavy artillery, and sophisticated anti-aircraft guns. Soviet tanks entering Herat were reportedly attacked with sticks and stones. In rugged Bamiyan province, 100 miles northwest of Kabul, A Soviet column was apparently ambushed by fierce Azerot tribesmen and forced to withdraw with numerous casualties. It took the Soviets 2 days to clear the city of Kandahar of Afghan army deserters and rebel sympathizers. On December 28th, President Carter termed the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan a grave threat to peace and a blatant violation of international rules of behavior.
President Carter made the famous statement that this really changed his impression of the Soviets. I forget the exact wording, but he was really shocked by it.
That same day, he used the hotline to demand that the Kremlin withdraw its troops and warned that the future of Russo-American relations would depend on Moscow's response.
When they ultimately decided to put the troops in, I think they had already decided that even if they wanted the SALT II Accord and needed it to help constrain U.S. weapons building, that this was more important, this sort of maintenance of their empire, than the idea of controlling the U.S., because it didn't look like the U.S. was going to be willing to do this anyway. Plus, frankly, the restraints in the SALT II Accord were so high that even when the Reagan administration announced that SALT was fatally flawed, it took them until the mid-1980s to violate it because the numbers were so high. So, from the Soviet perspective, it wasn't going to have much effect in the near term anyway. And then, who knows, maybe they could get it. So in terms of that kind of calculation, I think that was probably at work from the Soviet point of view. I mean, not taking into account the internal circumstances within the empire that made them want to go into Afghanistan. But it certainly had a big political shock effect in the United States and in the West that in some ways you could see it as an affront to the U.S. We were trying to negotiate, work on problems jointly, and here they just replicated Hungary and Czechoslovakia, right? I mean, it was the same old story of the Cold War.
In his reply the next day, Premier Brezhnev contended that the Soviet move had been made in response to a request for aid by the Afghan government, and maintained that the troops would be withdrawn after the crisis had been resolved.
The political right, the conservative elements of the Republican Party, that was just typical Soviet behavior. It wasn't, you couldn't trust them. They were expansionistic. They had forward doctrines and had to be contained.
Brezhnev's response was publicly criticized by President Carter as being completely inadequate and completely misleading.
Then in January of 1980, the month after the Soviet invasion, Carter makes his State of the Union address, much of which was written or influenced by Brzezinski, in which he lays out the Carter Doctrine, saying that any major threat by a power to the oil supplies in the Persian Gulf would be seen as a threat, a fundamental threat to American national security. So there was a perception at that time that maybe this was the first in a series of moves Soviets might make further southward to consolidate control in the Persian Gulf. Now, looking back on it, we know it was much more limited.
Significantly, although the Carter administration had pledged to resume military aid to Pakistan, there had been no discussion of any form of aid for the Afghan resistance movements. It would seem that Afghanistan has already been written off, in spite of the fact that more than a few experts suspect that the Kremlin's reach may have in fact exceeded its grasp. Although Afghanistan is a remote, obscure country which ranks among the poorest nations in the world, its strategic location endows it with a high degree of geopolitical importance. The Kremlin's incentives for expanding its influence to the south had been significantly enhanced by the growing importance of Middle Eastern, especially Persian Gulf oil, in the Western economic system. Seen from the vantage point of the Persian Gulf, the single most important energy surplus region in the world, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan constitutes one part of a giant pincer movement designed to encircle Gulf oil reserves. The Kremlin already has established a military presence in Ethiopia and South Yemen. At the other end of the pincer, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan constitutes a flanking movement which opens up the flat eastern border of Iran to potential Soviet military pressures. More importantly, it extends Soviet influence to within 350 miles of the Arabian Sea. Opposition to the Soviets did not become pronounced until the fall of 1978, when the government began to lose control of the countryside to fierce Islamist guerrillas called mujahideen, meaning justice fighter or freedom fighter.
There was already the resistance, remember, by the rural elements, by different, if you will, warlords or different, in different parts of the country. It was not coordinated. Afghanistan has always been pretty much fragmented. And in a way, it was a continuation of the rebellions of 1978 and 1979 against the communists. So when the Soviets came in, the appearance was they were simply propping up the communist government in Afghanistan. And so now it was, if you will, the situation was compounded in that you had a communist government which was disliked by the more traditional religious elements and now backed up by the superpower. And so it wasn't a matter of resistance starting from scratch, but more a continuation of what had been resistance before.
Organized along tribal lines, these ragtag armies set ambushes and cut country roads at will. The guerrillas, armed primarily with ancient bolt-action copies of Royal Enfield rifles made by village gunsmiths, had laid siege to government-controlled urban centers. The regime, for its part, launched a scorched earth policy in rebel strongholds along the Pakistani border, bombing villages and burning crops in an effort to intimidate villagers and force the rebels to spend their scarce resources on food and shelter. Although Soviet-supplied air power gave the ground troops the capability to decisively neutralize and defeat rebel offensives, it was clear that the Afghan army was incapable of defeating the insurgency without a significant escalation in the Soviet presence. When Ronald Reagan came to power, the Americans began to increase aid to the insurgency.
Eventually, the Reagan administration even generated a new policy that was beyond containment, that was the quote-unquote Reagan doctrine, which was trying to roll back these Soviet gains, which was eventually why the U.S. Really, sort of unofficially, non-publicly, but well-known, assisted the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but also efforts arguably in Central America against Nicaragua and also in Africa against Mozambique, less well-known. But in all of those places on the map, the Reagan doctrine was trying to roll back Soviet advances.
The United States, the United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia became major financial contributors to arming the Mujahideen, the United States donating $600 million.
Egypt provided some support, the Saudis were providing money, and most of it went through Pakistan. Apparently the Chinese were doing some things there in Afghanistan too on their own. There was something of a lull during the Reagan administration, after they came in, got their feet on the ground, but then it was after '84 that the major supplies began to be funneled in, Stinger missiles and so on. But I think the Reagan administration viewed it from the same perspective that at least Brzezinski did, and that was that this could easily be Vietnam for the Soviet Union. It could be something that would bog them down and cause them serious problems, which it did. I think it's overstated to say that it had a major impact on the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wouldn't go that far. But it was a bleeding wound, as Gorbachev called it.
In March 1985, under direct instructions from Director of Central Intelligence William Casey, the CIA initiated programs for training Afghans in techniques such as car bombs and assassinations, and in engaging in cross-border raids into the USSR. Many Muslims from other countries assisted the various Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan and gained significant experience in suicidal warfare. Osama bin Laden, originally from a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, was a prominent organizer and financier of an all-Arab Islamist group of foreign volunteers. His Makita el-Khadamat funneled money, arms, and Muslim fighters from around the Muslim world into Afghanistan, with the assistance and support of the Saudi and Pakistani governments. These foreign fighters became known as Afghan Arabs. The war now developed into a new pattern. The Soviets occupied the cities and main axes of communication, while the Mujahideen, divided into small groups, waged a guerrilla war. Almost 80% of the country was in control of the freedom fighters. In March 1985, the new Soviet General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, expressed his impatience with the Afghan conflict. He demanded that a solution be found before one-year deadline. As a result, the size of the LCOSF, limited contingent of Soviet forces, was increased to 108,800, and fighting increased throughout the country, making 1985 the bloodiest year of the war. However, despite suffering heavily, the Mujahideen was able to remain in the field and continue fighting the Soviets. Gorbachev began to look for a way to disengage. The first step of the exit strategy was to transfer the burden of fighting the Mujahideen to the Afghan armed forces, with the aim of preparing them to operate without Soviet help. During this phase, the Soviet contingent was restricted to supporting the DRA forces by providing artillery, air support, and technical assistance, though some large-scale operations were still carried out by Soviet troops. Under Soviet guidance, the DRA armed forces were built up to minimize the risk of a coup d'etat. They were divided into different branches, each modeled on its own Soviet counterpart. Finally, Soviet troops prepared and executed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. They hardly engaged in offensive operations at all and were content to defend against Mujahideen raids. Almost 10 years after their surprise assault, the first half of the Soviet contingent was withdrawn between May 15 and August 16. The second from November 15 to February 15, 1989. Now fighting alone, the DRA forces were obliged to abandon some provincial capitals. Once the Soviets withdrew, U.S. interest in Afghanistan ceased. The U.S. decided to hand over the interests of the country to U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Pakistan quickly took advantage of this opportunity and forged relations with warlords and later the Taliban to secure trade interests and routes. In April 1992, the communist government of Afghanistan fell to the Mujahideen, who replaced it with a new governing council for the country. This council was soon challenged by a hitherto unknown force called the Taliban, a Sunni Islamist political movement. The Taliban is primarily made up of members belonging to ethnic Pashtun tribes, along with volunteers from nearby Islamic countries. By September 1996, they had captured Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Terror now had a home.